Gerald Marsh wrote his son a cheque for $40,000 on a Tuesday morning in March at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast every day for 31 years, and he did it without hesitation, because that is what fathers do. His son cashed it the same afternoon. That was 11 years ago. The money was never mentioned again. Not once. Not by his son. Not at Thanksgiving. Not at Christmas. Not when Gerald's truck broke down and he drove a borrowed car for 6 weeks because the repair bill was more than he had in checking. Not when Gerald turned 70 and his daughter threw a small party and his son stood in the backyard with a beer in his hand, laughing at someone's joke. 11 years of silence sitting between them like a piece of furniture nobody was allowed to name. I need to tell you about that cheque, not because $40,000 is the point. The money is not the point. The money is just the shape the real thing took. Stay with me. Because if you have ever given someone you loved more than you could afford to give and watched them accept it the way you accept something that was always owed to you, and said nothing, and kept saying nothing year after year, until the silence itself became the whole relationship. This story belongs to you as much as it belongs to Gerald. What was in that cheque? I will get there. First, I need you to meet him properly. Gerald Thomas Marsh was born in 1949 in Boise, Idaho, the son of a man who believed that a father's job was to make sure his children had more than he did. Gerald's father had said this out loud more than once at the dinner table, with the particular conviction of a man who had grown up with very little and intended that fact to stop with him. Gerald absorbed the lesson completely. He worked for 38 years as a civil engineer for a county roads department in Central Oregon, a job that was not glamorous and not well paid by any measure that the modern world uses to measure such things. But that came with a small pension and a steadiness that Gerald valued the way his father had valued steadiness, as the thing that made everything else possible. He and his wife Ruth had 2 children, a daughter named Carol, who lived 40 minutes away and called on Sundays and visited on birthdays without being asked, and a son named Dennis, who had moved to Phoenix at 24 and called when he needed something and visited when it was convenient, and had, over the decades, developed a particular skill for making Gerald feel that any help he provided was merely the baseline expectation of a decent father, rather than a sacrifice. Gerald could not have told you when this pattern started. It had simply always been the texture of his relationship with Dennis, the slight lean in Dennis's direction whenever something needed leaning, the way Dennis's problems arrived with an implied question that Gerald answered before it was fully asked, because answering before it was asked felt like generosity, and Gerald had been raised to be generous. The $40,000 was for a business. Dennis had a plan, a landscape supply company, a gap in the Phoenix market he had identified, a partner he trusted, a timeline that made sense on paper. He presented it to Gerald over a weekend visit in February, with a folder of documents and a confidence that Gerald recognized from Dennis's childhood, the particular brightness in his son's eyes when he had decided something was a good idea. Gerald asked a few questions. Dennis had answers for all of them. Gerald asked Ruth that night in the dark what she thought. Ruth said, "You're going to do it anyway." She was not wrong. Gerald wrote the check 10 days later. He did not ask for paperwork. He did not ask for a repayment schedule. He did not ask for anything, because asking would have meant acknowledging that this was a transaction rather than a gift. And Gerald had not yet decided which one it was, and it was easier to leave it undefined. Dennis sent a text that evening. It said, "Thanks, Dad. This means a lot." That was the last time the money was mentioned. The business lasted 14 months. Dennis told Gerald about the closure on a phone call in June, a year after the check, briefly and without detail. The partner had turned out to be unreliable. The market timing had been off. These things happened. He did not mention the $40,000. Gerald did not mention it either. He told himself it was because he did not want to make Dennis feel worse about an already difficult situation. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that by the time Dennis was explaining the closure, Gerald had already understood, in the particular quiet way you understand things you do not want to understand, that the money was not coming back. He understood this the way you understand a door has been locked from the other side, not because anyone told you, but because you tried the handle and felt the resistance. Gerald never tried the handle again. He had a system built over decades of fatherhood for not trying handles that he suspected were locked. The system was called not wanting to damage the relationship. It was a reasonable system. It was also, as Gerald came to understand in the years that followed, a system that had never actually protected the relationship. It had only protected the appearance of one. Ruth died in 2018. Gerald was 69. Carol came and stayed for 2 weeks after the funeral. Dennis came for 3 days. Before he left, standing in the driveway with his bag over his shoulder, Dennis said he needed to talk to Gerald about something. A new opportunity. A partner he trusted this time. A market he had been watching. Gerald looked at his son in the driveway. He looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at something you are trying to see clearly for the first time after years of looking at it sideways. He said, "Dennis, I can't." Dennis said, "It's not a lot, just enough to get started." Gerald said, "I know, I still can't." There was a silence that was different from the 11-year silence about the $40,000. That silence had been avoidance. This silence was a man standing in his own driveway, making a decision he had never let himself make before, which was to say out loud, to the person it needed to be said to, the thing that was true. Dennis left. He was not angry, or at least he did not show anger. He hugged Gerald at the car door the way he always did, and said he understood, and drove away. And Gerald stood in the driveway for a while after the car was gone. His neighbour Dave, who had lived next door for 20 years, was trimming his hedge on the other side of the fence. He pretended not to have heard anything. Gerald appreciated this. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table. He was alone in the house for the first time since Ruth died, in a way that felt different from the weeks before, quieter, heavier, more like a fact he was finally holding squarely. He sat there for a long time. Then he got out a piece of paper and a pen, not to write to Dennis, to write to himself. He wrote one question at the top of the page. He wrote, "What did the $40,000 actually cost me?" And then he sat and answered it honestly, for the first time in 11 years. Here is what Gerald understood. The first thing was about the money itself. $40,000 at Gerald's income across those years had represented approximately 14 months of his pension contributions, redirected. It had represented the trip he and Ruth had talked about taking to the Oregon coast for their 40th anniversary, which they had not taken because the timing hadn't been right, which was another way of saying the money hadn't been there, which was another way of saying the money had been in Phoenix, in a landscape supply company that lasted 14 months. He had known this in the arithmetic part of his brain for 11 years. He had not let himself say it out loud, not even to himself, because saying it out loud would have required him to also say that he had chosen his son's dream over his wife's anniversary, and that was a sentence with too much weight to carry in a house where he still slept on his side of the bed. The second thing Gerald understood was harder, because it was about love. He had believed, for his entire fatherhood, that the way to love Dennis was to give Dennis what Dennis needed without making Dennis feel the cost of it. This had felt like generosity. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, Gerald understood that it had also been, in a way he had never intended and could not fully forgive himself for, a kind of dishonesty. He had let Dennis believe, through 30 years of answered questions, and provided resources and silences that swallowed real feelings, that love was something that arrived without weight, without limits, without the honest friction of two people who see each other clearly and say so. He had not given Dennis the chance to know what the $40,000 had actually cost, because he had never told him. And Dennis, raised on love that never named its own limits, had accepted it the way you accept something that has no price tag, as though it simply did not have one. Gerald was not sure, sitting at the table with his piece of paper, how much of that was Dennis's failure and how much of it was his own. He suspected the answer was complicated and probably even, and he wrote that down too. The third thing he understood came later in the months that followed, slowly, the way the most important things tend to come. Gerald had spent 11 years protecting a relationship that existed in his own mind, at the expense of honesty. The relationship with the real Dennis, the Dennis who could take a $40,000 gift and never mention it again, was a relationship Gerald had never actually had. What he had had for 11 years was a performance of a relationship, maintained by his own silence on one side and his son's apparent comfort on the other. The day in the driveway, the day he said "I can't," had been the first day of a different kind of relationship with his son. One where Gerald said a true thing and Dennis heard it, even if neither of them knew yet what to do with the truth. Dennis called 3 months later, not to ask for anything, just to call. The conversation was shorter than most and more honest than any they had had in years. Dennis did not mention the $40,000. Gerald did not mention it, but something in the way they talked was different, slightly less careful, slightly less performed, as though both of them had agreed, without saying so, that the thing they had been pretending not to know was now at least pretended about less. Gerald told Carol about the piece of paper, about the question he had written at the top. Carol listened without interrupting, which was her particular form of love, and when he finished, she said quietly, "Dad, I think you already knew the answer. I think you've known it for 11 years. I think you just finally let yourself write it down." Gerald thought about this for a long time. He decided she was probably right. He kept the piece of paper. He did not frame it or put it somewhere meaningful. He folded it twice and left it on the kitchen table, where it stayed for several weeks, because he kept meaning to file it somewhere, and kept deciding there was no category for it. There is no category for the thing you finally said to yourself that you should have said 11 years ago. You just leave it on the table and look at it sometimes, and eventually you fold it again and put it in a drawer where you know where it is. Let me ask you something honest. Is there a check you wrote, in money, in time, in years of silence, in mornings you spent worrying about someone who never thought to worry back, that you have never let yourself add up? Not because you do not know the number, but because the number has a name attached to it, and the name belongs to someone you love, and loving them has meant, for a very long time, not saying the number out loud. Gerald is 74 now. He talks to Dennis once a month, sometimes more. The $40,000 has still never been mentioned. Gerald has decided he is not going to be the one to mention it. Not because he has forgotten it, because he has finally understood that what he needed was not the money back. What he needed was to stop pretending, first to himself and then to his son, that the money had no weight. He has stopped pretending. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing that took him 11 years to do. Come down to the comments and type day 1. Tell me one thing, just one, that you have been carrying without naming. It does not have to be money. It might be a check. It might be a silence. It might be a relationship you have been performing instead of having. Just name it. Just write it down. I read every single comment. And if you know someone who has a number they have been careful not to add up, someone who loves in a way that has cost them more than anyone knows, send them this video. Do not say anything. Just send it. They will understand why. I will see you next time. Thank you for being here.